Hello everyone! Happy Sunday. I am Sheikh Jalal Ahmed and we are making a video today, myself and I, are making a video to talk about the Zeta Gen 2, a setup that our customer of both 949 Racing, Jeff Goji, and a customer of Fat Cat Motorsports, he's doing some evaluation between their Gen 2 Zetas and our FCM Elite. The first version he had from us with KBO, FCM Elite Stage 3, which is with KBO, our curb blow-off valve. And that was from 2015. And so he and I had a very detailed conversation just a little while ago, so I wanted to capture some of these thoughts and also to share some of the information he provided to me regarding the dyno testing of the Zeta. And I'll be doing some testing when he sends me the dampers, and I'm also going to share in a later video our FCM Elite valving as well. So this is just a kind of a brief overview to discuss what you can do, what are the impacts between utilizing what I call the 3 secrets of ride harmony and how that affects your suspension choices, your suspension design, if you're using these 3 secrets. And I've talked about in some other videos somewhat separately, but again I'll go over them in this video in a little bit more detail. So on this line in green, so Jeff has a 2nd Gen Miata, an NB, and it's a Mazda speed, so it's a bit more powerful than a standard, normally aspirated Miata, and he's done some work to make that even faster, and he runs in kind of an open class that is, I forget exactly what the classification is, but he's down in the Houston area. So he's got a Racing Beat 1 1/4 front bar, so that's indicated here, and it's a 1/4 inch wall thickness, sorry, 3/16 wall thickness, a stock rear bar, which is, well, I should say an NB rear bar, a standard NB rear bar, which is an 11. The standard Mazda speed bar is a 14 millimeter, so that's in this lower line here. And then he's running for our setup 800 pound front and a 600 pound rear spring, which gives ride frequencies of about 2.47 hertz in the front, 2.52 hertz in the rear. His weight distribution is around 52%. I'll go ahead and switch over to the spreadsheet. So this is our Ride Harmonizer spreadsheet, which is available for NA 1.6, NA 1.8 Miatas, as well as NB and C and D other cars as well. I'll make sure to put links. This is the NC spreadsheet. I'll put links in this video description so people can find them if they haven't already. And I need to update the website to show them too. So this is the same lines in these 2 lines here are for our FCM and then for the Zeta setup. And I'm just going to scroll down so you can see the inputs are. I've got about 2350 weight. I think that's correct. 200 pounds, and he said he's got about 52%. He's done some weight removal on the rear, so the car ends up being a bit more front biased with the weight. So given this, so this setup, he's got about 2% flat ride. I'll go back to this kind of highlighted version. He's got 1.02, which is the bounce frequency ratio, rear to front. So the rear is a little bit higher by 2% than the front. So he's got flat ride and a front roll couple of about 70%. And that's intentionally biased a bit higher than stock so that you have the ability to get on the power coming out of turns, and that keeps the rear end more stabilized. There's the roll stiffness, pound-feet per degree, 2972. The front roll stiffness, rear roll stiffness, and then this is the ratio between how much stiffness is coming from the bars, which is about 45%, versus the springs, 55%. So the lower line is the same configuration if he was using the standard Zeta spring rates and the Mazda speed or an adjustable 14 millimeter bar, say. So the Racing Beat 1 1/4 front, same setting on the bar. There's only 2 settings in the front. A 14 millimeter rear bar, either the Mazda speed or an adjustable rear, and then the 800, 500, which are the standard spring rates that the Zeta is recommended to come with. So this is the Super Miata page, the Zeta, and then at least by the default, when you go to their site, I just did, you get 800 and 500 as their default. You can pick whatever springs you want, but that's the combination that they seem to suggest as a default setup for kind of like an aggressive track, etc. Now that creates pitch. So you see now the front frequency is still 2.47, but they're using a 500 pound rear versus the 600 that we're using, or he's using, Jeff is. So you get 2.3 hertz in the rear, which actually gives you pitch, meaning that the higher frequency in the front will make the front kind of, if this is the car moving forward, the front's higher and the rear's a little bit softer, so the car is going to have this attitude, as opposed to our setup, which has the rear a little bit firmer and the front softer. It's going to have more of a stabilizing, I mean, it's not soft, but it's going to be more of a setting. There's going to be a set that happens to the suspension versus pitch. It's always going to be oscillating because the front is driving the rear. The front suspension is driving the rear down versus, in our case, the rear is driving the front down. And as the car moves forward and you go over bumps and dips, flat ride makes it so that the car settles more quickly and smoothly and with less damping needed. So that's a fundamental difference. And as I was talking to Jeff, because I was explaining to him kind of this concept I've been working on, these 3 key secrets to ride harmony, and that the very fundamental one is choosing flat ride versus pitch. It's like the foundation of your house. Everything depends on what you use as your foundation. If you don't have a solid foundation, if it's not stable, then no matter what you put on top of the house, it's gonna be weak, it's gonna warp, it's gonna, who knows, it's gonna fall apart to some degree. It's not gonna be a stable dwelling. And flat ride makes your platform stable. Porsches, BMWs, Ferraris, all of these Corvettes, all these cars use flat ride, including in high performance and racing setups. At least a lot of them do, especially people like Porsche. And I've been testing and utilizing flat ride on higher powered cars. In fact, there's a link I'll have to put up in the bar here to, well, I need to make a video talking about the Porsche frequencies, but even the Porsche GT3 has a significant degree of flat ride. And no, it's not because a Porsche is rear weight biased. That allows you to use a lower front roll couple because you want more weight transfer on the rear because you have more weight available. Flat ride simply has to do with how does the suspension settle. Whether you're front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, all wheel drive, doesn't matter. How does the chassis stabilize? Because then the design of the car, whether front or rear or all-wheel drive, determines how much front stiffness you need, say how much front sway bar you need versus how much rear, total sway bar stiffness. That's what the front roll couple takes care of. That's what that means, how much weight transfer happens across the front of the car versus the rear of the car. So if you can see in these two examples, between the FCM 800-600 and the Zeta 800-500, you have almost identical roll couples. You have 70.1% and 70.0%. That's essentially identical. The roll stiffness is essentially, again, the same. It's within, 5 divided by, that's less than, a quarter of a percent difference, 0.5% difference. It's the same roll stiffness between the two setups. The difference is that we're using a high enough rear spring rate to make the car stabilize and settle and give you this flat ride response, versus the Zeta, which is using less rear spring and more rear bar. So Jeff has already done this. He actually ran 800-500 for quite a while, and his setup was initially valved from us back in 2015 for 800-500. And so he was using pitch for a good while. And finally, through my desperate pleading, especially once he got 245 tires, I think it's the BF Goodrich Rival S 1.5 or the Hankook. I think it's a Hankook actually. I guess RS4. That uses a 15 by 10, if I remember correctly. And so he needed to get a bit more roll stiffness. So he went from a 28 millimeter racing beat bar, the 1 1/8 to the 1 1/4. And I said, Jeff, this is the time. Make it flat ride. So he did go with a bigger front bar, and he added a stiffer rear spring. So. This first variable, flat ride, choosing flat ride versus pitch, that means part 1. You've got 2 and 3, and I'll discuss the rest of them briefly in this video too. The next part about this is since he sent me the Zeta dynographs, and he got this from somebody who had PSI, Performance Shock, here up in Sonoma, just about an hour away from me, did these dynographs. And so Jeff did some detailed calculations. We've talked about the damping ratios and whatnot, and I won't go into that conversation about the damping ratios, but what he did observe, both from the seat of the pants, because he didn't have these dynos until very recently, and he's owned a set of Zetas Gen 2s for several months, and he's been testing and adjusting settings, and he actually said he had to use the same ride height as he had with the FCM shocks, although the FCMs are not a shorter body or shortened body from the standard Bilstein HD length like the Zetas are. The Zetas are aluminum body, they're threaded body, and they're shorter than a standard Miata shock. But we're using a softer bump stop than the Zeta, so you're getting more bump stop engagement, I guess a higher spring rate via bump stop engagement with the Zeta, front and rear. And he's going to be sending me the Zeta rear bump stops to test, because I've already made comments years back on a Miata forum thread that the Zeta rear bump stop, from Emilio's own admission, from what he's told, what he posted online, is that you can't let the suspension in the rear use the bump stop, because he said it stops working. So they've designed the suspension to, for the most part, not use it, or to use it as little as possible, whereas I prefer to say, if you're going to have a bump stop, make it soft, make it progressive, allow it to engage in a smooth profile. Like if this is the damper force, it needs to be a smooth profile. So that's what we focus on doing. So in this case, this is the front shock, and this is various settings. Now ours are not adjustable, so we've set up a certain damping profile. I'm not going to show that in this video. I'm going to show that in a later video. But the Zeta has a very soft initial damping, and then it has this progressive ramp. So no matter what setting you have, it has this, you know, similar opening force. So you have some compression, a little higher compression than rebound, which is good. That's beneficial, because it keeps the tire kind of wanting to track the ground on small motions. Softer rebound, which is again also good. And then it has this progressive increase, and then it goes into this nice blow off, because they have a spring-loaded needle, I believe, in their adjuster. So it's similar to what our KBO is doing in a way. But the interesting thing, the difference is that we're actually building up more low-speed force, which Jeff notices. He says that the front doesn't seem to really want to take a set unless you use a stiffer setting. So if you use like what is this, like 5 to 1 clicks, because this is 1 click from full stiff, I believe, and versus this is 5 clicks. So you have to get to a much stiffer setting to get a force profile that actually looks like our KBO, because our KBO is much more like this, except the problem is once you have this compression profile, you get a lot of rebound, and this is over 2 to 1. I think it's almost 3 to 1. At least it's over 2, depending on the setting you're using, in terms of rebound to bump. So the suspension is going to be losing travel. It's going to be basically jacking down. Like if this is your tire over the ground, and this is your suspension available to travel, the Zeta over oscillations is going to start to jack down and contact the bump stops. And he could feel that. That's actually why he had to raise the front of the car, raise the whole car all around, from the 4.5 inch pinch weld setting to 4.75 inch. And this is on the street, so he wasn't bouncing off the bump stops and jacking into them. And that's a problem. That's even at the softest settings, once you get to 10 inches per second here, even before that, but this at full soft, the Zeta will start to jack down by 6 inches per second, which is like a motion like this. So he was describing this in our conversation, that on certain features it feels nice, and if it's a sharper edge, you know, smaller sharper edge feature, it feels pretty good. But on a certain undulation, you'll kind of get this induced understeer, or just kind of like you said, the front end would start to wash out as you get over like a larger oscillation, and that's from this higher rebound profile than compression. The gas force wasn't tested here. When I get the dampers in hand, I'm going to be testing the gas force, and I'll post a video or graph on that. As soon as you start to tighten up the damper to make it more, you know, racy, because apparently some people think you need to have a knob, and you know, if you can't optimize a damper according to these 3 principles, then yes, you absolutely need a knob, so that you are controlling, you know, pitch oscillations. You're controlling you know, that the shock doesn't have enough damping at low speed versus mid and high speed, etc. So it'd be better off to have a compression profile more like either this blue one or this red one, which is like on the stiffer Zeta settings, but you'd want to have the compression blowing off more around 250 or so pounds versus continuing to build up to this high level and then finally blowing off, which is good. They were linear damping, now it's like compression, but the ratio of the rebound to compression is still high enough that you're getting jacking down. And that's going to also make the car more inconsistent, where the front end might start to jack into the bump stop in the front, and then the rear might also jack into the bump stop as well. So let's take a look at the rear dampers too. So this is the rear profile, and Jeff and I are both observing that at the softest settings, and he did the calculations, I think he actually made the comments about that right, where did he do it, like right here. He was saying that he found they feel underdamped is anything less than 5 from full stiff on the front, because they are underdamped. And he says like the damping ratios were very, very low. He says, but the rears, however, are hovering around 60% of critical. So he says the front end feels way better at 3 from full stiff. Well, so at this 3 from full stiff setting, where you're kind of in this, somewhere in this region, it'll feel better because you've got more compression coming in. But then you get all of this excessive rebound. So it'll feel better because that's where your compression is coming in. It's not developing a ton of rebound. I mean, which is good. I mean, this is again what we've been doing for a long time with all of our valves, all of our work is to emphasize compression and with less rebound, but we don't build up this much rebound. Certainly not anymore. And even since Jeff's earlier build, I used to use more rebound. His has less than this, but I still am over damped by about, it's like 1.6 to 1 in the front of his setup on his first generation KBO from 2015. So he's going to actually be getting a set of revalve from me. And I'm actually doing it for him at no cost to help demonstrate that our newest understanding of these 3 principles of 1, flat ride, and 2, non-jacking down, which is what we're talking about here, make the car much more consistent and stable, and you need less damping when you have flat ride. And if you don't have flat ride, if you have pitch, as the Zeta has pitch, then you need to add this extra damping to control the front trying to bounce and the rear trying to bounce. So you have to use the damper force to control these pitching oscillations, versus if you have flat ride, the car just naturally wants to stabilize. And again, I'll link to in the upper right to the video that I made called Why Flat Ride Matters, which the more that I talk about suspension tuning and damping and optimization, the more I realize that that is the most important video I've ever made, because it was an experiment where I had an Audi customer, Audi S4 Avant customer, who had airbags, and he had already come to understand flat ride's benefit from watching my video, What is Flat Ride and Why Should You Care? So he saw that video and did his own testing with the airbag pressures front and rear to get the car to have a better settling response and better handling and just better ride. And then he contacted me and said, hey, I've got these Olin shocks, these that I've had to have rebuilt twice. I'm about to do the 3rd rebuild in like less than 2 years. He lives in LA. It wasn't even an area that had really poor, winter conditions or anything. He's like, what can you do? And so, long story short, I wanted to do some Bilsteins, and FCM Bilsteins, KBO, Ripple Producer, all that. But I said, Greg, I don't know what your spring rates are with your airbags. The bag pressure doesn't tell me what the spring rates are. So why don't we bounce your car with no gas pressure, no damping fluid, no hydraulic oil in the shocks. So we did that. And when I was down in LA the weekend he did that, and I found that he trusted me enough to go for a drive. I said, why don't we just go for a little drive on the street? Because the shop had just finished doing the bounce test in the garage. And he said, you're crazy, right? There's no shock. The shocks aren't working. I'm like, let's just try it. Let's take it easy. So, long story, a little bit shorter, he found that the car transitioned really well. And that's because the flat ride was actually working. He had flat ride. He had much lower frequencies. It was more like, 1.7 front, 1.9 rear. This is, on the, firmer side. Actually, this is the same Greg. He now has a Mazda Speed Miata. He bought one. This is the same Greg. Greg Wodark, who has an Audi S4 Avant. So he could feel that the flat ride is making the car settle, but on the bigger bumps, you could feel that the lack of any damping was making the rear end bounce. And so essentially you needed to have some damping more in the rear to help stabilize the front. And that actually echoes what the Zeta is doing. As he said, the rear is more like 60% of critical. Basically, for similar damper settings, it seems like the Zeta, they're intentionally using the rear to help stabilize the car. And that makes sense. It becomes even more necessary to use even more damping when you have too much, when you have pitch. So this is, again, jacking down pretty strongly. comparable, again, on even at full soft, once you get above about 5 inches per second here, this is full soft setting, 20 clicks, 150, 120 pounds of compression, 120 pounds of rebound. Once you get past about 5, 6 inches per second, you're now causing the suspension to jack down. We're also going to talk about, once I have the dampers to test myself, we'll talk about the rebound to bump ratio, the gas pressure, the gas force, because he actually sent me the, where is it? Yes, so this is the hysteresis. So this actually comes into, like, this gap here at 0 inches per second is the damper loading up and the nitrogen chamber basically flexing and before the piston moves through the oil. So basically this is very poor hysteresis, and this is due to the shorter body, having a longer shaft, not enough nitrogen volume. The fronts don't look like this. The fronts actually have much better hysteresis. So that's one of the advantages of having disadvantages of having a shorter body and not being able to have sufficient gas chamber volume, and to also, if you're trying to build up too much compression force, you're basically collapsing the nitrogen chamber, which is not ideal. And that's another reason why when we use ripple reducer, and I could talk about that, a ripple reducer makes it so you don't have to worry about, or you don't have to use as much gas pressure. Oh, I have to plug in my, yeah, oh, I got it? Okay, plugged it in. Good, still recording. So this is not something you'll ever see on any of our setups. I mean, and also because we drill holes in the piston, we relieve pressure. I don't think the Zeta has any type of ripple reducer happening, which would allow us to use lower gas pressure already. I'm very, very curious what the measured gas force is on the Zeta, because I think it's going to be it's probably over 45 pounds, 50 pounds maybe. But again, I don't know, so I'm just going to I'll have to test it when I have that. Jeff might try to do a damping test when he has those. So kind of just going again over these principles related to the three key principles. We have flat ride, they don't, unless you purposely choose a higher rear spring and keep the front spring, you know, at that 800 and go to a 600 rear. We can use a smaller rear bar, which actually helps us get better grip off the rear. We would not be jacking down. That's not what we do to this extent, especially now that I know that I can actually make the front end softer. This is the rear shock. But if I make the front end neutral jacking, meaning minimal jacking down, and then the rear slightly more jacking than the front, so that you're, say, using the rear bump stop to help the cart want to rotate in very hard cornering, which also means you have to use a softer bump stop in the rear. And that's something that, from what I understand and what I've seen, is that the Zeta bump stop in the rear here doesn't, I remember looking at this several years ago and commented on it, that the Zeta bump stop is a similar density to the front, which is a fairly firm density. So when you start to use it, the suspension really just gets unstable from reports, from what I think even Emilio had talked about. So if you substitute this rear bump stop for a softer one, now you're going to have a more stable, more throttle-friendly rear end with less having to, you know, countersteer all the time and worry about catching it every moment. And then that last part about this is the gas pressure. Like, you know, having enough volume because this is a very short body, and apparently from what Jeff found is that he would like the fronts to be a little bit shorter potentially on ours. Maybe not a lot. We might actually even go to an ASN body, like a Bilstein aluminum body, which would be fantastic. But then the rears are probably too short, and that's at the very least, if they're either too short or the shaft length is overall too high for the body, so that there's not enough room to have a sufficient nitrogen chamber. So that's a problem. That's why this hysteresis ended up being, pretty high. In this graph, that this really should not look like that. Let me just pull up this other graph. Let me just hide this for a second, because he sent me a graph of the front hysteresis, and I'm gonna pull that up here. So yeah, so that's this front, and so this looks really good. This is tight. This is nice and stable. The pressure balancing looks good. You can see that this is a very tight range here at 0 inches per second, which is what you want, which means that you have sufficient nitrogen pressure. You're not displacing the nitrogen chamber via the shock moving through the oil, and then that little nitrogen chamber at the bottom doesn't flex nearly as much. The front could also have a little bit more pressure than is ideal. I don't know. And again, if they don't have ripple reducer in play. What's interesting is that even at the full stiff setting, it's not as crazy stiff as, I mean, we've provided some dampers that are even stiffer than this. So they're really using much softer low speed front, which is good for you know, kind of tracking surface features. This is a good thing that they're doing this. I think this is a change from the first Gen 1 to the Gen 2. But again, once you start getting enough compression going, actually this curve looks a lot like the compression on our KBO setup, except the rebound is just too stiff. It's going to cause jacking down. It's going to cause bump stop contact. So those are the three key elements, and I can talk about 1 and 2, the flat ride versus pitch, which is the foundation. And then the second part of the house, the construction, is rebound to bump ratio, whether you're jacking down or whether you're neutral jacking. You don't want launching either. You don't want too much compression, so you want to proportion the compression and rebound to be better balanced. This is not as well balanced. You would really want to have some softer rebound. And then the third aspect, the roof, the ornament, you know, all the nice decorations, is that gas pressure. That's the little. It can be overlooked. Like you can have a nice house, say, without a lot of little subtle touches, but it really completes the home to have, you know, the paintings and mirrors or whatever the case is, nice light coming in. You don't need it. You're not going to say this is a terrible house necessarily. Well, if you don't have any windows, it's going to be terrible. I mean, yeah, that can happen. So the gas pressure, which isn't shown on these graphs. I mean, PSI tested this, but I don't even know if they measure what the gas. The dyno is subtracting the gas force out of these dyno graphs. That's why everything is at 0. That's the problem. And so if you're not actually dealing with, and again, this is at 0. So what is the gas force? This is a lift. The whole curve is going to be lifted upward. What is that? How much is that? What's the effect of that? That's causing the jerk. That's causing an initial reactivity on the surface because you're trying to compress the damper. And I've got multiple videos I'll link in the upper right. I'll link one at a time, but the main one is that spring versus damper test that I did, where I illustrated on the scale what happens when you're trying to compress the damper and you have to load in 40 pounds, 45 pounds of force before the damper starts to move. And that means that every time the suspension tries to go into a compression movement, there's this resistance from that nitrogen gas force that's at the bottom of the damper here. That's what happens when you have the pressure. You need to have pressure in the monotube, but how much do you need, and what's the cost of having too much? And that's what doesn't get shown in these types of dyno graphs that just show the average force with the gas force subtracted. So we'll go into more detail once we have the dampers. I'm going to be getting the bump stops from Jeff, the rear bump stops, so I'll be able to dyno test the rear Zetas, and I'll post that. And then I'm going to do a revision on the FCM damping to hopefully, without shortening the bodies, I just want him to see what it's going to be like with all the optimization that I can do now. Most of it related to actually just making sure that we're not jacking down, in the front, and then going from there and seeing. He already says he's no faster with the Zetas than he was with the FCMs. He's finished at the same place, and it's harder to get to that point. That was his comment. So he'll be making his own observations, and I really appreciate that he, wants to see the pros and cons. And there is optimization that's possible with the Zeta. I mean, to me, it seems like if you soften the low speed, the rebound in the front, and probably in the rear as well, and maybe allowed for a little bit more like compression, like the softer compression settings, or maybe you'd actually even want to shift the compression curve just upward a little bit so that the starting compression was a little bit firmer and the final compression was a little firmer as well, so you could just kind of like just shift the curve. That would all help. Definitely use less high speed, and actually try getting a setup that has flat ride. Seeing what flat ride actually works like. Because, I mean, that's what he's doing. He's actually switched to Zeta from 800, 500 to 800, 600. So he's using this line with these springs and the sway bars. So he had to change that rear spring higher than what they normally recommend to get flat ride working. but now he's finding that even though he has flat ride, he's still dealing with problems from the rebound, and that's why he wanted to get these dynos. He's like, I'm trying to understand why the car has certain behaviors that I like and certain behaviors that I don't, and to see what's happening there. So those other two, like fundamental aspect, flat ride versus pitch, flat ride good, pitch bad. Second is jacking down, rebound to compression. But this is always jacking down at any of the race settings. And then the last one will be the gas pressure. So even if the gas pressure might not be able to be reduced, if somebody was able to specify to 949, like, look, I want to start off with a lower damper setting, less rebound, that means that the car will have less jacking down, and just select spring rates that create flat ride instead of pitch, and then to substitute a softer bump stop in the rear. And in fact, Darren DeSimo had contacted me some years ago and was driving a car that had Zetas and was saying that he was finding it really hard to keep it at the limit consistently. And so I said, well, you could do a couple things, but the biggest thing you could do is on the rear to use a softer rear bump stop. I don't have the bump stop included in this. Maybe just real briefly I can do that. And let's see what happens here, because I'm just going to say if this is a 200 front and a 200 rear. So you've got a roll couple change that goes from 70% to when you start to get into the bump stop, it drops by 4%. That would mean that the car would start to get into more of an oversteer condition. You go from a higher roll couple, more weight transfer across the front, to now it's shifting more toward the rear, which means as soon as the bump stop starts to engage, if you have a 200 pound per inch bump stop, it could be even higher than that. Since it's a shorter bump stop, the same material might be even higher. So you start to get into a much more oversteer orientation versus, let's say, with ours, I think actually right now Jeff is using like 100 pound front and rear. So he's a soft, it's a trimmed soft bump stop, but the roll couple there goes from, let me just make this back to 200, it goes from say 70% to 68%. So that's less oversteer bias. It still has a little bit of oversteer that's designed into the bump stop engagement, but it's less than this. And because the Zeta has so much more rebound bias, the Zeta is going to start to jack down and engage the bump stops even firmer than just this number might indicate. So it'll be interesting to see once Jeff tries our setup, and if there's people out there that are not yet, haven't bought Zetas, or they say they just want them, because there's, aluminum bodies are nice and knobs can be nice if you can't otherwise optimize the setup without it. I mean, we can, but if you just specify less rebound, and maybe we'll even come up with some damper curves that people can try to have the, Emilio have Tractive valve them to, or Emilio gets the guys in his shop to valve them to. And so you'll have a more consistent, less skeetery car. And, that'll be easier to drive, it'll be faster, it'll be better on the street, so everyone benefits. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you when we have more updates and more components to test. Take care.